Tell me about a time you had to make a difficult decision under pressure. And with that decision, how did you handle it and what was the outcome?
That's an amazing question. So, whenever I was on a long cross country here at Grand Forks for my training for my commercial, we left Devil's Lake where we were heading out to. And on the way back, we checked Grand Forks weather and noticed that it was deteriorating way quicker than we had forecasted before. So I took that information by myself and decided on what my next actions were going to be because I knew that if I didn't land back at Grand Forks, I would have to talk to the SOF and I would have to come up with more solutions following that. So what I did is I viewed for weather at Fargo and weather at Grand Forks and decided which one was safer for me. And in that instant, I made a pretty good PIC decision to head to Fargo, which the weather was still VFR. And once I diverted over there, I made sure to contact ATC to let them know what was happening, what I was doing, where I was going. And then once I landed on the ground, I contacted the SOF to let them know officially why I made that decision and that I'm going to be a little bit later just waiting for that weather to get better and clear up. Following that, when I landed on the ground, I made sure to call my instructor. That way, I was much more communicative with him to tell him I did this for this exact reason. And he gave me the good green light, told me I made the correct decision, and that just to hold off for a few hours, and then I can be able to fly back safely to Grand Forks.
Awesome. Okay. So next, describe time when you had a conflict or disagreement with a crew member and how did you resolve it?
Yeah. So I flew with my instructor currently that I was working with, and we went out to a normal practice area and we were going to be performing accelerated stalls. And in that instance, I walked through the steps of it and I started my clearing turns. And I noticed that there was another crew off to the south of me that I wasn't aware of before, but they were heading in my direction. So I made sure to communicate that with my instructor and that he understood that there was someone in the area and that it wasn't just me doing that maneuver, which can be very dangerous around people. So I decided to do another clearing turn and give the people enough time to get away from us. However, they still stuck around, so I told him I would like to divert to another side of the practice area to give ourselves good distance away from that crew, in which he was a little bit upset that we didn't begin the maneuver sooner because we were on a little bit of a tight schedule. So when we got back and we landed, I made sure to tell him that even if we were ever on a tight schedule here at UND, that I will always prioritize safety and how, because the crew was that close to us, I was uncomfortable, and me, as the PIC, decided to make that decision to officially divert and continue the maneuver. We decided to agree on it. He said that was a good decision in the end. He had just been stressed about time schedules lately, and that we would then again schedule the next flight. So everything worked out. We just made sure in the moment that I told him I prioritize safety over practicing a maneuver next to someone.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, so next, tell me about a time when a flight didn't go according to plan and how did you adapt?
Awesome. So this is a very interesting story. So we were taking off here at Grand Forks, and I decided to continue my checks, my climb checklist, and we leveled off for cruise. And I began my visual scans for traffic around the area because it is pretty busy here at Grand Forks. And I looked off to my left and I noticed that my fuel cap had fallen off during takeoff. Now, in that moment, I decided to check the damage if there was any on the wing, and then I looked over at my instructor and I made sure that he was okay with it. And I told him exactly what had happened, and I noticed that he began to panic slightly. So I decided to take over a few of the comms. So I talked to ATC and I talked to Tower. I didn't declare an emergency just yet. I just wanted to let them know what they needed to know in that moment so that we had this issue where we switched tanks over. Everything's fine. We would like to come back to Grand Forks for a safe landing. He agreed. I made him do checklists so we could split up the tasks so I could focus on talking to people. ATC rerouted us back, and I landed safely at Grand Forks. However, on the ground, when I looked over at my instructor, he was truly panicked because he was the one that forgot to screw on the fuel cap. So I made sure to let him know that it's completely okay. It was a safe landing. We'll look for the fuel cap on the ground. Do you need help getting out of the plane? In which he did. I helped him out of the plane, and we talked about it on the ground, and then we ended up talking to the SOF at the end of the day. But overall, I made sure to split the task. It was important for the safety to land carefully, even with that fuel cap issue, and then make sure that he was okay on the ground.
That's great, Sarah. Okay, so next, have you ever had a mentor had to mentor or support a less experienced crew member, and how did you approach that?
Yeah, great question. So here, luckily at UND, we have the Aerospace Learning Center, which is where anybody in our entire flight system can come in and ask questions if they need it or look for help. And in this instance, when I volunteered during my commercial training, I had someone come in who was a brand new private student who was struggling with the E6B calculator, which can be very difficult. It's a very strange thing that we still have to use. So in this instance, I sat him down. He was a little panicked because his block exam was coming up, and all I understood that I needed to know was to help him calm down and teach him the basics of the E6B. So in that instance, I sat him down. I said, do you want to meet a few times this week before your block exam? So I established a schedule for him to come in. And then I also presented him with an excellent resource, which I still use today, which is that online E6B calculator where you can put in your calculations and it'll show the E6B turning and moving. That way you can get that mental structure of how the instrument works. And then following that, he came in every day. We exercised it. He got much better and more confident at the end of the day. So that was the overall goal and the task. And then the result at the end of the day, he ended up passing his block exam. So it was a very good experience for both of us. I got to be able to start teaching someone and also practice my own E6B skills to keep myself updated.
That's so awesome. Okay, so next, give an example of a time when you received feedback, positive or negative, and how did you respond?
Okay, awesome. Yeah. So whenever I was in my instrument training, the best thing that I could remember that would best describe this question is I was shooting an ILS approach. And as I briefed the approach and shot the approach, everything was doing great. We landed, and I believe that it was one of the best approaches I've done. So I was pretty proud of myself because that means learning is going somewhere. We sat down the debrief. He made sure to tell me all the good things that happened, but my instructor did inform me that I did not brief the missed approach section of the approach briefing correctly because here at Grand Forks we have different missed instructions than what are published. So I made sure while he was giving me that, I understood that he wasn't just yelling at me, he wasn't getting on to me, he wants me to do better. So I made sure to take down notes in the middle of this, making sure that I wrote down the correct missed instructions for that approach, and then I also asked for future reference, where can I find these missed instructions? And so he then ended up pulling our safety policies and procedures, the section, and then he showed me the overall procedure on missed approach points. So that was great learning experience. I was able to write them down and also flag the page on the safety policies and procedures. And then that way from now on, I will always be able to have the correct missed instructions for specifically here at Grand Forks. So it was a good learning experience.
Awesome. Okay. Next, can you describe a situation where you had to balance following procedure with also exercising your own judgment?
Okay, yeah. So here at Grand Forks, we have something where we have to call a final check where we are fully stabilized and we're configured for the landing that we plan on doing well before 200 feet above the ground. However, in this instance, it was a little different. So when I was coming on final, I'd already called my stable check and I was ready to land. However, a flock of birds ended up flying past final and intercepting our flight path. In this instance, I knew that I wanted to get down on the ground safely as possible, not as quickly as possible. So I decided to go ahead and initiate a go around where the birds would then fly away and go around. So I put in that full power, pitch that nose up, and then tell my instructor that I'm going around because of the birds. And I told him, so we could split up the task, to go ahead and let Tower know why we were doing that and to help other people who were landing and informing them of the birds around that area. So in that instance, even though I was already had that final check done, I was already ready to land and was completely configured. I understood that since the birds interfered the flight path, that I absolutely needed to go around and make the safety call of that day.
Awesome. Okay, next I'll have you tell me about a time you made a mistake and what did you learn from it?
Yes, that's a great question. So when I was a private student, everyone is still learning pretty much taxi instructions, especially with a big airport, because I came from a smaller airport. So in this instance, getting used to Grand Forks was a little bit of a difficult challenge for me, but I decided on my first solo that whenever they gave me the taxi instructions that it was simple and I stuck to the bias of expectation where, okay, it's just standard taxi, I'll be fine. But I never ended up looking and writing down the standard taxi procedures for it. So I knew the general direction of the runway. I made sure to pull out safely, look left, look right, and cleared. And then I continued on. However, I forgot the next instructions of it. So I stopped immediately on the runway, turned off my landing light, and made sure to ask ATC for a progressive taxi. So I understood that I needed to get to the runway, but I didn't understand exactly the route that they wanted me to take at that time. So I asked for a progressive taxi. They then gave me a progressive taxi, and I was safely able to take off and continue my local solo that I had planned that day. When I landed on the ground, the biggest lesson of that was I will always write down taxi instructions no matter what they are, if it's standard, if it's abbreviated, everything. So from then on and all the way up through my training now, I've written down the taxi instructions every single flight just in case I look up and I'm a little lost on where I am.
That's great. Okay. How do you stay motivated during routine or repetitive tasks?
So here at UND, we get used repetitive tasks. So we have the same checklist, the same emergency checklist, the same taxi instructions of the standard taxi that I just talked about. But however, I don't let myself fall into that expectation bias that we talked about. So how do I keep myself motivated constantly? Small goals. So keeping myself waking up, all right, let's wake up, let's get a good enough sleep, let's eat before the flight, let's show up early, that way we're on time. Once I'm getting there, I then start, now let's run through the pre-flight checklist correctly. Now let's run through the takeoff checklist correctly. As long as I'm doing one small step at a time, I'll be able to completely get through the entire flight with minimum errors. And when I do make errors, I admit them. I admit that I made errors that day, and then I motivate myself on positive feedback. So the biggest thing here is that whenever I landed, yes, I made that error. However, the majority of the flight was very good, keeping myself fully arranged around which checklists to do, which procedures to do, even maneuvers that they have us do here at UND. So the biggest thing I remember is that even the result, it may not be the best, but learning is a process. So that's what I would say.
Awesome. Okay. My next question I have for you is, how do you maintain focus and manage fatigue during long or regular flight schedules?
Awesome. Yeah, great question. So when we do our commercial flight training, we have to build up to those 250 hours. And in those instances, when I got assigned an instructor here at UND, I had a flight every single day for 2 weeks straight just to get through the training. I hit a mental fatigue moment in those instances, which is completely okay because we're students and we're learning. So what I told myself is if I have a flight the next day, which I did, and I wasn't up for it, I always stick to the I'm safe checklist. So I had to cancel a few in a row because there was a time when I ended up getting sick and I understood that I wasn't going to be able to perform as well as I could. So I made sure to let my instructor know that I wasn't going to be able to do the long cross country for my overall commercial training that day because of how fatigued I was. So the overall goal was always make the decision before the flight and don't be afraid to make the decision. So just because we're on that tight time schedule doesn't mean that we absolutely have to stick to it 100% of the time. And that was the biggest thing I learned from that.
Awesome. All right. So my last question for you, how do you build and maintain positive working relationships with new crew members you've just met?
Oh, great question. Respect, number one, is what I will always strive for. We meet a lot of new people here. It's a university. Also, we've had up to 10 instructors so far throughout our flight careers, and they're all different with their own characteristics. Respect is the number one goal I work towards. No matter what their bias is towards me or my bias towards them, I treat them how I would want to be treated, and that's how I will continue my training for hopefully the rest of my life. And going on from this, first impressions. So when we meet our next instructor for the next flight course, my favorite instructor that I've ever met, we had an interesting first impression recently where I didn't understand what he was really striving for. And then he ended up telling me the next day he had a rough day, rough flight, but this is who I truly am. And now we are really great friends. So first impressions do matter. Always treat them with respect. And remember that even if you don't really get along with them, they are your instructor. They are your overall colleague that you need to respect side by side. And that was the biggest thing I learned.
Well, that's great, Sarah. Thank you so much for answering my questions.
Awesome. Thank you.